I am Megan, 33 years old, and exactly 8 months pregnant with my late husband's child. My own family always mistook my quiet patience for weakness. They assumed my grief over losing my husband 6 months ago made me an easy target. Just a few hours ago, my sister Courtney laughed maniacally as she hurled my leather handbag into a muddy ditch, leaving me stranded in the freezing dense fog of the Cascade Mountains. "Go for a walk and relax," she mocked, through the rolled-down window. "It will be good exercise." My father hit the gas, and their black Range Rover sped off down the remote logging road, abandoning a heavily pregnant widow in a sprawling national forest as temperatures rapidly dropped. They thought they had finally broken me, assuming I would freeze panic or beg for their mercy. They had absolutely no idea that I had been wearing a wire for 6 months, and they had just handed the federal government the exact felony charge needed to destroy their entire empire. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to outsmart toxic family members who underestimated your worth. The silence that followed the fading roar of the Range Rover was deafening. I stood alone on the damp gravel shoulder of the mountain pass. The Cascade Mountains are unforgiving, even in the peak of summer, but in late autumn, the descending fog feels like a wet, freezing blanket wrapping around your bones. I watched the taillights of my parents' luxury SUV disappear around the bend, leaving me with nothing but the sound of the wind rustling through the towering pines. Below the steep embankment, my beige leather purse was slowly sinking into a pool of thick, icy mud. Inside that bag was my wallet, my car keys, and my primary cell phone. They had calculated this perfectly. They wanted me utterly cut off from the outside world, stripped of any means to call for a taxi, a friend, or an ambulance. A sharp gust of mountain air hit my face, and I instinctively wrapped my woolen cardigan tighter around my swollen belly. At 8 months pregnant, carrying the only piece of my husband Ryan that I had left, the physical vulnerability should have been terrifying. My lower back ached from the turbulent car ride up the mountain, and the biting cold was already numbing my fingers and toes. Any normal person in my situation would have collapsed onto the jagged gravel and sobbed uncontrollably. Any normal daughter would have been completely paralyzed by the sheer, unnatural cruelty of her own mother and father driving away and leaving her to the elements. But I was not just any daughter, and I was long past expecting a motherly instinct from a woman who viewed me only as a financial asset to be leveraged. Just 20 minutes prior, the interior of that SUV had been an absolute war zone. My father, Howard, had screamed until his face turned purple, demanding I sign over the $3 million life insurance policy Ryan had left for our child. He needed it as collateral for his shady real estate business, a business my golden child sister Courtney was currently running into the ground. When I firmly refused my mother, Nancy immediately weaponized my grief. She told me I was a selfish widow who never cared about family loyalty and that I owed them for raising me. When I still refused to sign their fraudulent guarantor papers, my father slammed on the brakes in the middle of nowhere and delivered his ultimate threat. Sign the papers or walk 15 miles back to the nearest town in the freezing mist. I chose to unbuckle my seatbelt and step out of the car. The cold seeped through the soles of my sneakers, grounding me in reality. The dense tree canopy above blocked out the fading afternoon sun, casting the deep forest in an eerie, dim twilight. The temperature was dropping fast, approaching freezing. The nearest ranger station was miles away, and the logging road we were on saw almost zero traffic this time of year. To my family, this was their ultimate power play, a brutal psychological tactic to force my submission. They genuinely believed that a few hours of shivering terror in the wilderness would break my spirit, forcing me to surrender my child's future to feed their endless greed. I took a deep breath, the crisp, pine-scented air filling my lungs. I did not cry. I did not scream for them to come back. Instead, I stood perfectly still on the deserted mountain road, feeling a profound sense of clarity wash over me. I brushed a speck of dirt off my maternity jeans and rolled back the sleeve of my sweater. I glanced down at the silver watch on my wrist. The second hand ticked past the 12. It was exactly 4:00 in the afternoon. I let out a slow, steady exhale, watching my breath turn to white vapor in the freezing air. A small, cold smile crept onto my face as I stared down the empty road. "Right on schedule," I whispered to the empty forest. As my boots crunched against the gravel, the biting wind seemed to carry the echoes of the screaming match that had just taken place inside that suffocating leather interior. I kept my pace steady, letting the memory of their desperation fuel my adrenaline. 15 minutes ago, the temperature inside the Range Rover had been boiling. Howard had gripped the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. He did not ask for my help, he demanded it. "We are facing a temporary liquidity freeze, Megan." My father had declared, his eyes darting to the rearview mirror to glare at me. "The firm needs a cash injection to bridge a few delayed construction loans. You are going to sign over Ryan's life insurance payout as collateral. It is a mere formality. You will have the $3 million back with interest before the baby is even born." A temporary liquidity freeze. That was his sanitized term for a collapsing Ponzi scheme. "No," I replied evenly, resting my hands protectively over my stomach. "That money is for my child. It is the only thing Ryan left us to ensure our future. I am not risking it on your real estate fund." The word "no" was not in my family vocabulary, especially not when it came from me. My father slammed his fist against the dashboard, rattling the expensive air freshener. "It is not a risk," he roared, his voice bouncing off the tinted windows. "It is a family obligation. We put a roof over your head for 18 years, and this is the gratitude you show." My mother, Nancy, twisted around in the passenger seat. Her perfectly highlighted hair and diamond tennis bracelet stood in stark contrast to the ugly sneer on her face. "You have always been so utterly selfish, Megan," she spat, her voice dripping with venom. "Even when you were a child, everything had to be about your feelings, your boundaries, and now look at you playing the tragic grieving widow to avoid your responsibilities. Do you think you are the only one who has ever suffered? Ryan was a public servant. He understood sacrifice. He would be disgusted to see you hoarding millions while your own flesh and blood faces financial ruin. He would want you to help us." The sheer audacity of her invoking my dead husband's name made my blood run cold. Ryan despised them. He saw right through their country club facade to the rotting foundation beneath. But I did not yell back. I had learned long ago that reacting to their provocations only fed their narcissistic supply. Sitting beside me in the plush back seat, my sister Courtney let out a theatrical sigh, adjusting her $1,000 cashmere scarf that my parents had undoubtedly paid for using stolen funds. "Honestly, Megan, you are being so incredibly dramatic," she whined. "Trey and I put everything into managing this company. We are all making massive sacrifices for the family legacy. Why should you just get to sit on a mountain of cash while we do all the heavy lifting?" I glanced at Trey. As an educated African-American man with a stellar financial background, he had been paraded around by my parents to secure minority business loans, but behind closed doors, they treated him like a glorified fall guy. They had made him the chief financial officer on paper, ensuring his signature was on every single fabricated tax return. Trey kept his eyes glued to the floor mats, rubbing his hands together nervously. He knew the company was a house of cards, but his cowardice kept him completely silent. "I am not signing the guarantor papers, Courtney," I stated, my voice devoid of emotion, "and I am not having this conversation again." That was the moment my father lost his mind. He swerved the heavy luxury SUV violently onto the shoulder of the dirt logging road, slamming on the brakes so hard the seatbelt dug sharply into my collarbone. Dust plumed outside the windows as the engine idled aggressively. He turned around, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. "You listen to me, you ungrateful little brat," he hissed, pointing a trembling finger at my face. "You are not leaving this vehicle until you sign the transfer authorization. I have the documents right here in the glove compartment. You either sign them right now, or you can get out of my car and walk the 15 miles back to the highway. Let us see how long your stubbornness lasts when you are freezing in the dark." My mother smirked, crossing her arms in silent agreement. Courtney let out a cruel, mocking giggle from the seat next to me. They fully expected me to break. They expected me to burst into tears, apologize for my defiance, and sign away my child's financial security just to stay warm. Instead, I looked my father dead in the eye, calmly unbuckled my seatbelt, and pulled the door handle. The icy mountain air rushed into the heated cabin. I stepped out onto the gravel, slamming the heavy door shut behind me, sealing their fate. The heavy thud of the car door slamming shut felt like a physical punctuation mark on my past. I stood on the side of the mountain pass, the crunch of their tires spinning in the loose dirt, echoing through the trees as they sped away. I walked for about 10 minutes, keeping up the charade just in case my father decided to look in his rearview mirror one last time. My breath billowed in white clouds, and the freezing fog clung to my eyelashes. Once the road curved and I was entirely shielded by a thick grove of evergreen trees, I finally stopped walking. I was entirely alone, exactly as I had planned. Beneath my heavy maternity sweater taped securely to my ribs, the microscopic audio transmitter was still broadcasting. My family never noticed it. They were always too busy admiring their own reflections to look closely at me. I leaned against the rough bark of a massive pine tree to balance my shifting weight. Being 8 months pregnant made bending over a strategic operation. I reached down and unlaced my left orthopedic sneaker. My mother had mocked these bulky shoes just yesterday, calling them a tragic fashion choice, completely unaware of their actual purpose. Pregnancy swelling provided the perfect excuse for the oversized footwear. I pulled the shoe off, ignoring the bite of the cold air against my sock. Digging my fingernails under the thick foam insole, I peeled it back to reveal a hollowed-out compartment in the thick rubber sole. Nestled securely inside was a compact, heavy-duty satellite phone. I pulled the device out and pressed the power button. The screen illuminated immediately, searching for a signal through the dense canopy above. Within seconds, the connection locked in. I did not need to dial a number. I simply pressed and held the single emergency speed dial key. It rang exactly once before a gruff, familiar voice answered on the other end. "Agent Keller here. Are you secure, Megan?" "I am secure," I replied, my voice steady despite the shivers beginning to run down my spine. "I am currently at mile marker 14 on the old logging route just past the ridge. They left me exactly where we anticipated." "I have your GPS coordinates locked," Keller said, the sound of keyboard clacking echoing through the receiver. "We had a drone repositioned over the forest canopy the moment the vehicle stopped. The extraction team is 3 minutes away. Are you unharmed? How is the baby?" "We are both fine," I assured him, resting a hand on my stomach. "Just a little cold." Did the wire pick up everything clearly? Loud and clear, Keller confirmed, a hint of grim satisfaction in his tone. "We have the entire audio feed from the SUV. Your father explicitly demanding the $3 million life insurance transfer. Your mother weaponizing your husband's death to coerce you. And the physical threat of abandoning you in a remote wilderness if you did not comply. It is a textbook extortion and endangerment charge wrapped up with a neat little bow." For 6 agonizing months, I had played the role of the broken, helpless widow. When Ryan died in the line of duty as a firefighter, my world shattered. But my paralyzing grief turned into laser-focused rage the moment I realized my family was circling like vultures. They tried to use his life insurance payout to patch the bleeding holes in their collapsing real estate empire. They assumed my tears made me blind. They forgot that I am a senior forensic accountant who spends her days dismantling corporate fraud for federal prosecutors. While they were busy demanding I hand over my money, I was quietly dismantling their entire financial existence. I had spent every night for the past half-year tracing their offshore accounts and untangling their web of shell companies. I mapped out exactly how they funneled innocent investors' funds into their private luxury accounts, paying for things like their $4 million vacation cabin, while everyday families lost their life savings. I documented every single forged signature they forced Trey to sign. They thought they were running a flawless $50 million Ponzi scheme. They did not realize their own daughter had already handed the entire blueprint to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. "I have the final signed affidavits ready," Keller said over the static of the satellite connection. "The moment you give the word, we freeze every bank account attached to Howard, Nancy, and Courtney. The state attorney general is on standby for the press conference. We just needed them to make one final undeniable misstep to trigger the immediate arrest warrants without bail. Leaving a pregnant woman to freeze in the wilderness certainly fits the bill. I said, a wave of profound relief washing over me. The charade was finally over. I did not have to pretend anymore. I looked down the empty dirt road, visualizing the sheer panic that was about to rain down on the people who had treated me like disposable garbage my entire life. I took a deep breath of the sharp mountain air. They just committed felony reckless endangerment, I told Keller, my voice ringing with cold authority. The trap is set. Execute the warrants. 15 miles away, completely oblivious to the federal dragnet closing in around them, my family was busy celebrating their perceived victory. The interior of their $4 million mountain cabin was a masterclass in excessive wealth purchased with stolen money. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the darkening pine forest, while a massive stone fireplace crackled, throwing warm light across the imported Italian leather furniture. The sharp pop of a champagne cork echoed through the vaulted ceiling, followed by the clinking of crystal flutes. Howard poured the expensive vintage with a wide, self-satisfied grin plastered across his face. A toast, he announced, raising his glass toward the blazing fire. To tough love, and to securing the future of this family legacy. Nancy chuckled, adjusting the cashmere throw blanket over her legs. She took a delicate sip of her champagne. Honestly, Howard, you should have done that years ago. The girl has always needed a firm hand. She will walk a mile, her feet will start to blister, and she will realize that her little independent act is nothing without our financial backing. She will sign those papers the second she thaws out. Courtney was sprawled across the plush velvet sofa, scrolling mindlessly through her social media feed. She let out a scoff of agreement. She is probably crying on a stump right now. God, she is so pathetic. It is actually embarrassing to be related to her. While the three of them reveled in their cruelty, Trey was the only one not holding a glass. He was pacing furiously back and forth across the heated hardwood floor, his hands rubbing the back of his neck in frantic, anxious motions. He kept glancing out the massive windows at the gathering fog, the muscles in his jaw ticking. "This is insane!" Trey finally blurted out, stopping his pacing to glare at his wife. "You just left her out there, on a deserted logging road. It is dropping below freezing, Courtney. She is 8 months pregnant. Do you have any idea the kind of legal liability we are looking at if something happens to her or that baby? That is reckless endangerment. That is a felony." Courtney rolled her eyes, not even bothering to look up from her phone. "Oh, calm down, Trey. You are acting like such a coward right now. You are completely ruining my buzz. She is not going to die. She is just learning a lesson. It is called family business, something you clearly still do not understand." Trey stepped closer to the sofa, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "Family business? You mean the business where my name is on every single tax document? The business where I am listed as the chief financial officer, while you and your father forge signatures and shuffle money through fake LLCs? I only agreed to this because you promised me we were doing everything by the book to get those commercial loans. Now you are leaving pregnant women to freeze in the woods." Howard slammed his champagne flute down on the marble kitchen island. The sharp crack made Trey flinch. "You listen to me, Trey," my father growled, pointing a thick finger at his son-in-law. "You enjoy this cabin. You enjoy the cars, the tailored suits, and the country club membership. We brought you into this family. We gave you a seat at the table, and we elevated your entire life. You are the CFO of this company because I put you there. So you will stand by your wife, you will keep your mouth shut, and you will show a little gratitude." The toxic power dynamic was suffocating. They paraded Trey around boardrooms to secure minority-owned business grants and favorable loan terms, leveraging his pristine financial background. But in the privacy of their home, they treated him like a rented mule. They made him the legal face of their fraudulent empire, ensuring that if the walls ever caved in, Trey would be the one buried under the rubble. And Trey, paralyzed by his fear of losing the opulent lifestyle Courtney provided, swallowed his pride and looked at the floor. "You need to act like a man, Trey," Courtney sneered, taking another sip of her drink. "Stop whining about a little cold weather. Megan has always been a dramatic crybaby. She will trudge her way back to the main road, find a phone, and call us to apologize. That is what she does. That is what she has always done. Trey looked back out the window, the darkness now completely swallowing the forest outside. He swallowed hard, his voice trembling slightly as he asked the one question that was tearing him apart. But what if she does not call us? What if she actually goes to the cops? Howard threw his head back and let out a booming, arrogant laugh that echoed off the cabin walls. Let her go to the cops. She is a spineless accountant who is terrified of her own shadow. She has no proof of anything regarding the company, and it is our word against hers about the road. Do not worry about Megan. She will be begging at the front door by sunset. While my family was comfortably insulated in their bubble of delusion, my reality was shifting gears rapidly. Just over the ridge from where they had abandoned me, the heavy rumble of an engine broke through the mountain silence. A sleek black unmarked SUV emerged from the thick fog, its tires crunching aggressively over the frozen dirt. The vehicle pulled up right next to me and the tinted passenger door swung open immediately. Agent Keller sat in the driver's seat, his face illuminated by the glow of the digital dashboard. He was a seasoned federal agent, his expression usually carved from stone, but as he looked at me, a pregnant woman standing alone in the freezing wilderness, a flicker of genuine disgust crossed his features. Not toward me, but toward the people who had put me there. "Get in, Megan," he instructed quietly. "Let us get you warm." I climbed into the heated cabin, the sudden rush of warm air making my skin tingle uncomfortably as my body temperature began to regulate. Keller reached over and handed me a large thermos of hot tea and a thick woolen blanket. I wrapped the blanket around my shoulders and cupped the thermos, letting the heat seep into my numb fingers. I took a slow sip, the warm liquid grounding me. I did not have time to dwell on the emotional toll of what had just happened. My mind was already moving 10 steps ahead. Keller did not waste time on pleasantries. He reached into the back seat and retrieved a secure government-issued tablet, handing it to me along with a stylus. "The extraction team has secured the perimeter around the cabin," he informed me, keeping his eyes on the rearview mirror as he navigated the SUV back toward the main highway. "We are holding position exactly 2 miles down the mountain. We just need your final verification on the asset maps before the Attorney General goes live." I balanced the tablet on my knees, my fingers flying across the screen as I accessed the encrypted files I had compiled over the last 6 months. The spreadsheets were a sprawling, chaotic web of deceit, but to a forensic accountant, they read like a clear map of criminal intent. I navigated through the shell companies, the phantom LLCs registered in Delaware, and the offshore accounts in the Caymans. I cross-referenced the wire transfers with the forged loan applications Trey had signed. The evidence was irrefutable. "It is all here," I confirmed, my voice steady and clinical. They were running a classic Ponzi structure. They used the capital from their new commercial investors to pay off the dividends of the early investors, siphoning off roughly 20% of every transaction into their private trust fund to maintain their lifestyle. The total fraudulent exposure is just over $50 million. Keller nodded grimly. "And the life insurance policy they tried to extort from you. That was their desperate attempt to plug a sudden liquidity gap," I explained, pulling up a specific flag transaction. "A major commercial lender called in a $5 million note last week after spotting irregularities in their collateral valuations. My father's accounts are overdrawn. He needed Ryan's $3 million to stall the bank and keep the scheme afloat for another month." I opened the final document on the tablet. It was the official federal whistleblower affidavit, the legal instrument that would formally trigger the asset freezes and the arrest warrants. I read through the dense legal jargon one last time. This document was the culmination of my grief, my anger, and my relentless pursuit of justice for the husband they had mocked and the child they had tried to steal from. I took a deep breath, picked up the stylus, and signed my name on the digital line. "It is done," I said, handing the tablet back to Keller. Keller took the device and immediately transmitted the file to headquarters. He tapped an earpiece hidden in his ear. "Command, We have the signed affidavit. The whistleblower has verified the $50 million fraud threshold. All criteria for immediate asset seizure are met. You are clear to proceed with Operation House of Cards. The digital clock on the SUV's dashboard flipped from 3:59 to 4:00 o'clock. The timing was perfect. I knew my family's habits better than they knew themselves. Every Sunday afternoon, without fail, my father would pour himself a drink and turn on the massive television in the cabin to watch the football pregame show. It was a sacred ritual of his arrogance, a moment to relax and revel in his perceived dominance over the world. I took another sip of my tea, feeling the warmth spread through my chest. I looked over at Keller, a cold sense of anticipation settling over me. "Turn on Channel 7, I told him, my voice devoid of any hesitation. They always watch the Sunday football pregame, and they are about to get the shock of their lives. Back at the luxury cabin, my father settled into his custom leather recliner, remote in hand, completely unaware that his carefully constructed world was about to detonate. He cranked up the volume on the 90-inch flat screen mounted above the stone fireplace. The familiar, energetic theme music of the Sunday football pregame show blared through the surround sound speakers. My mother, Nancy, leaned against the marble kitchen counter, admiring her reflection in a silver serving tray, while Courtney continued to mindlessly scroll on her phone, occasionally tossing back the remainder of her expensive champagne. Trey was the only one who seemed incapable of relaxing his eyes, darting between the front door and the sprawling windows as the mountain fog thickened outside. Just as the sports anchors began discussing the upcoming quarterback matchup, the screen abruptly froze. The stadium crowd noise cut out, replaced by a sharp, high-pitched emergency broadcast tone. The screen flashed bright red before transitioning to a stark graphic. Breaking news. Howard frowned aggressively, mashing the buttons on the remote. "What the hell is this?" he grumbled, leaning forward. "I pay for the premium sports package. Fix the connection, Trey." Trey did not move. He was staring blankly at the screen as the graphic faded away, revealing a live feed from the state capitol building in Olympia. A row of American and state flags provided the backdrop for a polished wooden podium. The state attorney general, a stern-looking woman known for her aggressive prosecution of corporate crimes, stepped up to the microphones. The room full of reporters fell dead silent. "Good afternoon," the attorney general began, her voice echoing through my parents' living room with absolute authority. "Today, my office, in a joint operation with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, is announcing the immediate shutdown and asset seizure of one of the largest real estate fraud rings in state history. For over 5 years, a single organization has defrauded commercial lenders and private investors out of more than $50 million through an elaborate Ponzi scheme and forged financial instruments." The champagne glass in my mother's hand suddenly looked very heavy. She set it down on the marble counter with a sharp clink, her eyes widening. Howard froze in his recliner, his thumb hovering uselessly over the remote control. The color began to drain from his face as the Attorney General continued. "They preyed on the trust of their community," the Attorney General stated, her gaze piercing through the camera. "They funneled illicit capital through a network of ghost LLCs to fund a lavish personal lifestyle, while everyday citizens faced financial ruin. The individuals responsible believed they were untouchable because they operated behind closed doors. They were wrong. Today, arrest warrants have been executed for the senior leadership of the firm." Courtney finally looked up from her phone. "Dad," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "What is she talking about? She is not talking about us, right? There are hundreds of real estate firms in this state." Howard swallowed hard, but he tried to maintain his arrogant facade. "Of course not," he snapped, though his voice lacked its usual booming confidence. "It is just some political theater. Probably some low-level flipper who got caught cutting corners. We are perfectly insulated. Trey made sure of it." He shot a venomous glare at Trey, but Trey was completely paralyzed. His hands were gripping the back of the velvet sofa so tightly his knuckles were white. He knew exactly what this was. He knew that the ghost LLCs and the forged financial instruments the Attorney General just mentioned were the exact documents he had been forced to sign week after week. We were able to build this airtight case thanks to the immense courage of a key insider, the Attorney General announced, stepping slightly away from the podium. A certified forensic accountant who covertly gathered irrefutable evidence from within the organization over the past 6 months, risking everything to bring this massive criminal enterprise to light. The camera operator panned slowly to the right, adjusting the focus to reveal the people standing on the stage behind the Attorney General. The frame tightened on the primary whistleblower. Howard stopped breathing. Nancy let out a short, choked gasp. Standing there on live television, flanked by federal agents, was me. I was not shivering in the freezing mud of the Cascade Mountains. I was not crying on the side of a deserted logging road. I was standing tall in the Capitol Rotunda, dressed impeccably in a tailored navy blue maternity blazer. My hair was perfectly styled, and my expression was one of absolute unshakable calm. I looked directly into the camera lens, knowing exactly who was watching on the other side. The woman they had just abandoned to freeze to death was currently dismantling their entire $50 million empire on statewide television. "What the actual hell?" Courtney shrieked, jumping up from the sofa. "How is she there? We just left her on the mountain." Trey finally found his voice, though it came out as a hollow, terrified whisper. "She is a forensic accountant," he breathed, his eyes wide with absolute horror. "She has been investigating us the whole time." The champagne glass finally slipped from my father's limp fingers. It hit the hardwood floor with a sharp, violent crash, sending a shower of crystal shards and expensive vintage splashing across the imported Turkish rug. He did not even flinch. He just stared at the television screen, his mouth hanging open in a grotesque mask of shock and absolute disbelief. Courtney shattered the stunned silence. She lunged forward, grabbing the edge of the marble island, and let out a high-pitched, ear-piercing scream directed right at my broadcasted face. "Turn it off!" she shrieked, her face turning an ugly shade of crimson. "Trey, turn the damn thing off right now!" But Trey remained frozen, his eyes locked on the television as if he were staring down the barrel of a loaded gun. On the screen, I did not falter. The camera zoomed in slightly as I leaned closer to the microphone. My voice, amplified through the cabin's high-end surround sound system, was eerily calm and methodical. The organization in question, I stated clearly, my eyes boring directly through the lens, is Apex Pinnacle Holdings, operating under the public front of Cascade Mountain Properties. My father physically recoiled as I spoke the name of his crown jewel out loud on live television. The news chyron at the bottom of the screen flashed in bright red letters, confirming the $50 million fraud investigation. The Attorney General nodded for me to continue, stepping back to let me command the podium. "For the past 6 months, I explained to the entire state of Washington I have worked closely with the Federal Financial Crimes Division. We have traced tens of millions of dollars of investor capital that was illegally diverted. This money was meant for commercial development, but was instead funneled through a network of shell companies specifically designed to launder the stolen assets into private family trusts." Nancy sank to her knees right there in the kitchen, her manicured hands covering her face. The horrifying reality was crashing down on them all at once, suffocating the arrogance right out of the room. For half a year they had looked at me and seen nothing but a broken, grieving widow. They had mocked my quiet demeanor. They had ridiculed my oversized maternity sweaters, entirely ignorant of the federal recording devices hidden securely beneath the heavy fabric. They had invited me to their Sunday dinners, openly discussing their illegal maneuvers right in front of me, assuming I was too depressed and too weak to comprehend the magnitude of their crimes. They thought my silence was submission. They did not realize I had not been grieving in their presence. I had been hunting. I was systematically dismantling their entire legacy brick by brick while they clinked champagne glasses to their own brilliance. The woman they had just cruelly abandoned on a freezing logging road to teach a lesson was currently executing a flawlessly timed federal raid on their lives. I pulled out a single sheet of paper on the broadcast, looking down at my notes. "We have seized the assets of these primary shell entities," I read, ensuring my enunciation was flawless for the court reporters. "Oak Ridge Ventures, LLC, Horizon Apex Management, Silver Cloud Equity, and North Star Holdings." With every name I dropped, Trey's breathing grew shallower. He backed away from the velvet sofa, his hands trembling violently as he gripped his own hair. He looked like a man who had just been handed a death sentence. Those were not just random corporate names to him. They were the specific holding companies my parents had forced him to register under the guise of expanding the family business. Courtney began to hyperventilate, pacing frantically in circles. "This cannot be happening," she muttered over and over, pulling at her hair. "She is lying. She is making it all up because she is jealous. Dad tell me she is making it up." But Howard could not speak. His face was pale, his eyes darting frantically around the room as if looking for a hidden exit. The absolute control he thought he had over his empire, over his family, and over me had been a complete illusion. Furthermore, my broadcasted voice continued to echo through the cabin, ruthless and unyielding. "We have secured the original forged loan applications that authorize the illegal transfer of these funds. The FBI has already obtained the unredacted ledgers bearing the signature of the company's chief financial officer." Trey let out a sound that was half gasp, half sob. The room started spinning around him. The blood drained entirely from his face as he looked at my parents, who were now staring back at him, like cornered, desperate animals. Trey suddenly realized with absolute terrifying clarity that he was the chief financial officer. His signature was on every single fraudulent LLC I had just listed on statewide television. The realization hit Trey like a physical blow. He stumbled backward away from the television screen. "You set me up!" he screamed with sheer panic. "You set me up to take the fall!" He spun around and lunged toward the heavy front door, desperate to escape before the authorities arrived. He reached for the handle, but Nancy threw herself in front of him. My mother, who usually prided herself on maintaining perfect composure at all times, looked completely deranged. Her hair was disheveled, and her eyes were wide with a feral, desperate kind of rage. "Get out of my way," Trey shouted, grabbing her shoulders to move her aside. "I am not going to federal prison for your crimes. I have a son. I am going to the police right now and telling them everything." The sharp crack of Nancy's palm striking Trey's face echoed over the television broadcast. She slapped him so hard his head snapped to the side. "You are not going anywhere," she hissed, her voice dripping with a venom Trey was only just now truly experiencing. "You owe us your absolute loyalty. Who do you think you are talking to? We plucked you out of mediocrity and handed you an extremely lucrative career on a silver platter. You are the chief financial officer. Your signature is on the documents. If we go down, you go down right next to us." Trey staggered back, holding his cheek, staring at his mother-in-law in absolute horror. He looked over at Courtney, expecting his wife to defend him, to step between him and her deranged mother. Instead, Courtney marched across the room and stood shoulder to shoulder with Nancy, glaring at her husband with absolute contempt. "Do not look at me like that," Courtney snapped, jabbing a manicured finger into his chest. "Mom is right. You owe us, Trey. We gave you this lifestyle. We gave you the tailored suits, the luxury cars, and the respect in the country club. Do you really think any commercial bank would have looked twice at your loan applications if my father's name was not backing you up? We used you to meet minority business quotas for those commercial grants, and you happily cashed the checks. You knew exactly what was going on, and you looked the other way because you liked the money just as much as we did." The ugly, prejudiced manipulation of my family was finally dragged out into the harsh light of day. They had never viewed Trey as a son-in-law or an equal partner in their business. They viewed him as a highly educated prop, a convenient shield made of a different skin color to deflect suspicion from their very elite white-collar crimes. And the moment that shield was no longer useful, they were fully prepared to throw him directly under the bus to save themselves. "I did not forge those documents," Trey cried out, tears of utter desperation streaming down his face. "Howard stood over me and told me what to sign. You told me it was completely legal. You told me it was just completely legal. You told me it was just creative accounting. You used my name to protect yourselves because you knew this day would come. I am not doing it. I am calling the authorities myself and cutting a deal." Trey reached into his slacks and pulled out his phone, his hands shaking so violently he could barely unlock the screen. He was completely unhinged, driven by the primal, visceral fear of losing his freedom, his future, and his young child. He began dialing the local police precinct, completely ignoring the fact that federal agents were already on their way. Courtney lunged at him, trying to claw the phone out of his hands, screaming that he was a traitor and a pathetic coward. The two of them grappled in the entryway of the cabin, knocking over an expensive vase that shattered into 100 pieces on the floor. Nancy joined the fray, hitting Trey's back and screaming for Howard to do something. The pristine, luxurious interior of the mountain retreat dissolved into an absolute brawl. The picture-perfect family was tearing itself apart like rabid animals, turning their fangs on each other the second the money disappeared. "Shut up, all of you! Just shut up!" Howard's booming voice suddenly rattled the windows, cutting through the chaotic screaming. He was standing by the stone fireplace, his face completely drained of color, but his eyes burning with a desperate, frantic energy. He had his own cell phone pressed tightly to his ear, listening to the ringing on the other end. "Stop fighting right now," he commanded, his chest heaving. "Just stop panicking. I am calling my high-priced defense attorney. We are going to fix this mess right now." Howard pressed the phone tightly against his ear, his fingers white-knuckled around the device. The room had fallen into a tense, suffocating silence. Even the televised broadcast seemed to fade into the background as Nancy, Courtney, and Trey turned their desperate attention toward the patriarch of the family. Howard paced in front of the roaring stone fireplace, his chest puffing out as he waited for the call to connect. He was a man who believed that any problem, no matter how catastrophic, could simply be buried under a mountain of expensive legal paperwork and intimidation. Mitchell Howard barked the moment the line clicked open, not even bothering with a greeting. "I need you to file an emergency injunction right this second. Call the Attorney General's office. Call the network executives. My ungrateful daughter is on live television spewing defamatory lies about Cascade Mountain properties. I want her shut down. I want her sued into oblivion. I want you to completely destroy her credibility and file a gag order before this circus goes any further." There was a long, heavy pause on the other end of the line. When Mitchell finally spoke, his voice was completely devoid of the deferential, eager tone he usually reserved for his wealthiest clients. His words were sharp, clinical, and ice-cold. "Howard, you need to stop talking right now," Mitchell said. "Every word you say over an unsecured cellular line can and will be used against you in a federal indictment." Howard scoffed, running a hand through his thinning hair. "Do not lecture me on protocol, Mitchell. I pay your firm a $50,000 monthly retainer to fix my problems, not to give me legal warnings. Now do your job and file the injunction." "You do not pay me anything anymore," Howard Mitchell replied, his tone brutally flat. "As of 10 minutes ago, my firm has officially severed all ties with you, your family, and every single corporate entity associated with Apex Pinnacle Holdings. I am no longer your legal representation." The arrogance instantly drained from Howard's face. His pacing stopped abruptly. He fumbled with the phone, his thumb accidentally pressing the speaker button as his hands began to shake. The lawyer's voice now echoed clearly through the silent cabin for everyone to hear. "What are you talking about?" Howard demanded, his voice cracking slightly. "You cannot drop me as a client. We have contracts. I am your biggest account. If this is about money, I will double your retainer right now. I will wire you $100,000 the second we get off this phone." "You cannot wire me a single cent," Howard Mitchell said over the speaker, and for the first time, there was a hint of genuine pity in the ruthless lawyer's voice. "The federal government moved faster than anything I have ever seen in my 30-year career. Your daughter did not just blow the whistle. She handed them a flawless, heavily documented roadmap to every single dime you have ever moved." Howard gripped the edge of the wooden mantel, his knees suddenly feeling weak. "What exactly does that mean?" he whispered. "It means you are completely broke," Mitchell stated plainly to the entire room. "The FBI and the Financial Crimes Division executed a synchronized sweep. Your domestic bank accounts are frozen. Your offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands have been seized. Your personal retirement funds, Nancy's trust accounts, and the corporate operating accounts have all been locked down under federal asset forfeiture laws. You literally have nothing left." "That is impossible," Howard gasped, the reality refusing to compute in his mind. "We have fail-safes. We have hidden accounts. Trey set up the blind trusts. Blind. Your daughter is a senior forensic accountant, Howard Mitchell reminded him harshly. She found the blind trusts. She found the routing numbers. I am looking at the federal seizure notices right now. In fact, your wife tried to process a transaction for a designer handbag online 7 minutes ago. The platinum credit card was declined. All of your credit lines have been revoked. You cannot even afford to hire a public defender right now. Across the room, Nancy let out a horrified whimper. She had heard the words, platinum credit card declined, and instinctively clutched her chest as if she had been shot. Courtney was completely frozen, her mouth hanging open in sheer terror. The empire they had built on the backs of stolen money and destroyed lives had evaporated into thin air in less than an hour. Trey leaned against the wall, sliding down, until he hit the floor, burying his face in his hands. Howard stood paralyzed, the heat from the fireplace suddenly feeling like the flames of hell licking at his back. He looked around his $4 million mountain retreat, the Italian leather furniture, the imported rugs, the expensive champagne soaking into the floorboards. It was all gone. The power he had wielded over me, over Trey, over innocent investors had been stripped away completely. Mitchell, please. Howard begged, his voice reduced to a pathetic, trembling whine. You have to help me. I am a desperate man. What do I do? I have to hang up now, Howard Mitchell said quietly. And I suggest you look out your window. The line went dead, with a hollow click. Howard stood frozen in the center of the living room, the cell phone still pressed against his ear. For a few agonizing seconds, the only sound in the $4 million cabin was the low hum of the television broadcast still running in the background and the crackle of the burning logs in the fireplace. Then another sound began to bleed through the thick insulated walls. It started as a low rumble, a heavy mechanical vibration that seemed to shake the very foundation of the mountain retreat. Howard slowly lowered the phone. It slipped from his trembling grip and clattered loudly against the imported hardwood floor. He turned his head toward the massive floor-to-ceiling windows that stretched across the entire front facade of the cabin. Nancy and Courtney stopped their frantic pacing and followed his gaze, their faces pale and drawn tight with mounting dread. Even Trey lifted his head from his hands, his tear-streaked face reflecting the sheer terror of a man who knew his life was over. Through the thick gray fog that had descended upon the Cascade Mountains, a terrifying light show began to unfold. Blinding flashes of red and blue violently pierced the mist. The strobing lights bounced off the glass panes, casting chaotic, frantic shadows across the luxurious Italian leather furniture and the marble countertops. It was a visual assault, a sudden and undeniable invasion of their isolated sanctuary. Courtney rushed forward, pressing her manicured hands flat against the cold glass. Her breath fogged the window pane as she peered out into the driveway. "Dad," she whimpered, her voice cracking into a high-pitched squeal of genuine panic. "Dad, what is happening?" It was not a single local police cruiser arriving to ask questions. It was an absolute armada. The heavy crunch of gravel echoed through the valley as an impenetrable line of vehicles swarmed the property. At least a dozen matte black, unmarked federal SUVs tore up the pristine half-mile driveway, moving with military precision. Flanking them were heavily marked state trooper cruisers, their sirens silenced, but their light bars blazing, turning the dark forest into a blinding neon nightmare. The vehicles moved swiftly, executing a perfectly coordinated blockade. Two cruisers parked sideways across the custom wrought iron entrance gates, completely sealing off the only exit. Several more SUVs formed a tight semicircle around the front porch. The message was clear. There was absolutely no escape. The fortress of wealth and arrogance they had built with stolen money was now their prison. Howard stumbled backward, his knees finally giving out. He caught himself on the edge of the velvet sofa, his chest heaving as he struggled to draw breath. He watched in horror as federal agents clad in dark tactical gear poured out of the vehicles. They moved with terrifying efficiency, fanning out across the meticulously landscaped property, securing the perimeter with heavy rifles strapped across their chests. "Fix it!" Courtney shrieked, spinning around to face her father. She stomped her foot on the floor like a spoiled toddler who had just been denied a toy. "Fix it right now. Call the governor. Call the mayor. You pay these people, tell them to get off our lawn. But Howard had nothing left to say. The master manipulator, the man who had controlled every narrative and crushed anyone who stood in his way, was reduced to a hyperventilating shell of a human being. Nancy collapsed against the kitchen island, weeping hysterically, mourning the immediate loss of her platinum credit cards and country club status rather than the impending loss of her freedom. Trey remained on the floor, rocking back and forth, muttering a frantic prayer under his breath. The family dynamic had completely shattered, leaving behind four pathetic criminals cornered in a glass box. Outside the lead FBI command vehicle, a massive reinforced SUV ignored the paved circular driveway entirely. The driver gunned the engine and barreled right over the decorative stone border parking directly on the manicured front lawn. The heavy, aggressive tires tore deep, muddy trenches into the expensive imported turf. The engine cut out and the blinding headlights illuminated the front porch of the cabin. The heavy passenger door of the lead vehicle swung open with a solid metallic thud. A pair of practical, thick-soled orthopedic sneakers stepped down onto the muddy grass. Courtney gasped, stumbling away from the window, as if the glass had suddenly turned burning hot. Nancy stopped crying, her jaw dropping in absolute stunned silence. Howard gripped his chest, his eyes bulging as he stared through the strobing lights. Emerging from the federal vehicle surrounded by armed agents and looking completely untouched by the freezing wilderness they had abandoned her in was me. The heavy doors of the federal vehicles flew open in unison, creating a synchronized metallic clatter that echoed off the mountain ridges. Dozens of agents wearing dark tactical gear and bulletproof vests swarmed the meticulously landscaped property. They moved with a terrifying practiced efficiency that completely shattered the quiet luxury of the $4 million estate. My father had spent his entire life bullying contractors, underpaying staff, and intimidating smaller investors, but he had never faced a force he could not buy off or scream into submission. FBI federal search warrant! A commanding voice boomed through a megaphone, cutting through the thick fog. Everyone inside the residence, step out with your hands clearly visible immediately. Inside the cabin, the reality of the situation finally broke through their collective state of shock. Trey was the first to move. He scrambled off the hardwood floor, his hands raised high above his head, his face slick with sweat and tears. He stumbled toward the heavy oak front door, practically throwing it open. "Do not shoot," he cried out, his voice cracking. "I am coming out. I am cooperating." Two heavily armed agents instantly flanked him, grabbing his arms and pulling him roughly out onto the porch. They spun him around, pressing him against the exterior log siding, and kicked his legs apart to frisk him. Trey offered absolutely zero resistance, sobbing uncontrollably as the cold steel handcuffs snapped tightly around his wrists. Howard and Nancy emerged next. The patriarch of the family looked like a deflated balloon. The custom-tailored suit he had been wearing to watch Sunday football suddenly looked ridiculous against the backdrop of federal raid jackets. He walked stiffly, his hands raised half-heartedly, still trying to maintain some shred of his usual arrogant dignity. Nancy clung to his elbow, her face completely ruined by mascara, tracks trembling so violently she could barely walk down the two porch steps. "Move," the lead agent barked, shoving Howard firmly toward the line of waiting cruisers. Hands on the hood now. Courtney was the last one out. She stepped onto the porch, her expensive cashmere sweater snagged on the doorframe. Her eyes were completely wild, darting frantically across the sea of flashing lights until they locked onto me. I was standing next to Agent Keller, perfectly still, my hands resting comfortably in the pockets of my maternity blazer. The sight of me looking completely unbothered, standing on the right side of the law while she was being treated like a common criminal, completely broke whatever fragile sanity she had left. "You ruined my life!" Courtney shrieked, her voice tearing through the cold mountain air like a wild animal. "You jealous, psychotic little freak! You ruined everything!" She completely ignored the armed federal agents surrounding her. Driven by pure narcissistic rage, she lunged off the porch. Her hands curled into claws aiming directly for my face. She wanted to hurt me. She wanted to drag me down into the mud and prove that she was still the golden child, the untouchable princess of the family. She did not even make it 3 steps. 3. Two female FBI agents intercepted her with brutal efficiency. They grabbed Courtney's arms, twisting them forcefully behind her back, and slammed her face first onto the cold, wet hood of a state trooper cruiser. The sickening thud of her impact echoed across the driveway, followed immediately by her outraged screams. "Get off of me," she wailed, kicking her expensive boots wildly against the tires. "Do you know who my father is? Do you know how much this sweater costs? Let me go." The agents ignored her pathetic demands, forcing her wrists together and slapping the cuffs on tight. "Stop resisting, or you will catch an assault charge on top of the federal fraud indictment," one of the agents growled, pressing Courtney's cheek firmly against the cold metal. I did not flinch. I did not take a step back. I just stood there watching the sister who had thrown my purse into a muddy ditch an hour ago now writhing against the hood of a police car covered in dirt and humiliation. The power dynamic had shifted permanently. The fear and intimidation they had used to control me my entire life evaporated into the freezing fog, leaving nothing but four pathetic criminals facing the full weight of the United States justice system. "Megan," my father gasped, struggling against the agent holding him against the adjacent cruiser. "Megan, tell them to stop. Tell them this is a misunderstanding. We are family." I looked at him, the man who had threatened to leave his pregnant daughter to freeze in the wilderness. My expression remained entirely neutral, devoid of any sympathy or regret. "You should save your breath, Howard," I said, my voice carrying clearly over the chaos. "You are going to need it for the arraignment." Howard's mouth snapped shut. He looked at me with a mixture of terror and revulsion before an agent pressed a hand to the back of his neck and guided him roughly into the back seat of the cruiser. The heavy, reinforced door slammed shut, sealing him inside the cage of the police vehicle. Seeing her husband completely neutralized and her golden child handcuffed to the hood of a car, Nancy realized instantly that rage and intimidation were no longer going to work. The aggressive tactics had failed. It was time for her to deploy her secondary weapon. The blinking red and blue lights illuminated the sudden shift in her facial expression, highlighting the terrifying ease with which she could manipulate her emotions. Almost as if a director had called action on a movie set, my mother completely shifted her demeanor. The vicious, snarling woman who had just slapped her son-in-law across the face vanished. In her place appeared a frail, terrified, and deeply wounded matriarch. Her shoulders slumped and she let out a loud theatrical sob that echoed across the driveway. Tears began to stream down her face, ruining her expensive makeup as she looked at me with wide, pleading eyes. "Megan, please," Nancy wailed, her voice trembling with manufactured heartbreak. She took a step toward me, her hands clasped together in front of her chest. "Please, you have to stop this. You are destroying our family. Show some mercy. I am begging you on my hands and knees. Have some mercy for your own mother." Agent Keller immediately stepped forward to block her path, his hand resting casually but firmly on his utility belt. "Ma'am, you need to stay back," he warned, his tone entirely devoid of sympathy. But Nancy was a master manipulator. She ignored Keller completely and kept her tear-filled eyes locked onto mine. She pushed past the agent's outstretched arm, acting as though a mother's love could conquer any federal blockade. She stumbled forward, reaching her hands out as if she were trying to pull me into a warm, protective embrace. "Oh, my poor, sweet girl," Nancy cried, her voice dropping an octave to sound soothing and maternal. "I know why you are doing this. You are in so much pain. You are 8 months pregnant and your hormones are completely out of balance. The grief of losing Ryan has just been too much for you to bear, and it has clouded your judgment. You do not know what you are doing, darling. You are confused. You are making a terrible, terrible mistake. Let me hold you. Let us go inside and fix this together." It was a masterful performance. If I had been anyone else, if I had not spent my entire life studying her toxic playbook, I might have actually believed that she cared about my well-being. She was trying to weaponize my pregnancy and my status as a grieving widow, attempting to paint me as an unstable, hysterical woman in front of the federal authorities. She thought she could gaslight me into retracting my statements by wrapping her manipulation in the guise of maternal concern. She reached her arms out, aiming to wrap them around my swollen belly to physically claim me and assert her dominance under the guise of a hug. I did not step back. I simply raised my right hand, my palm facing outward in a universal gesture of absolute rejection, and stopped her dead in her tracks. "Do not touch me," I said. My voice was not loud, but it was incredibly sharp. It cut through her fake sobbing like a scalpel. Nancy froze, her arms suspended awkwardly in the air, just inches from my chest. She looked up at my face, searching for a trace of the desperate, eager-to-please daughter she had molded me to be. But she found nothing. My expression was completely made of stone. "Megan," Nancy whispered, letting her lower lip tremble perfectly. "How can you be so cold? I am your mother. I gave you life. I have sacrificed my entire life to provide for you, to give you a good home, to make sure you were taken care of. And this is how you repay my love, by trying to send me to a cold prison cell." She looked around at the federal agents, trying to garner their sympathy. "Look at her," Nancy pleaded to Agent Keller, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Look at how heartless she is. I sacrificed everything for this girl, and she is standing there trying to destroy me." The agents remained completely stoic, unimpressed by her performance. I slowly lowered my hand, keeping my eyes locked onto hers. The sheer audacity of her claiming to have sacrificed anything for me ignited a cold, calculated fire in my chest. She had spent 33 years rewriting history to make herself the hero of every story and the victim of every inconvenience, but the cameras were no longer rolling on her terms. "You want to talk about your sacrifices, Nancy?" I asked, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. "You really want to stand here in front of the Federal Bureau of Investigation and discuss exactly what you sacrificed for me?" Nancy blinked, a flicker of genuine uncertainty finally breaking through her carefully constructed mask. She opened her mouth to speak, but I was already preparing to tear her entire maternal facade to absolute shreds. I stepped off the porch and walked slowly toward my mother, stopping just a few feet away. The flashing lights illuminated the sheer terror hiding behind her fake tears. "You sacrificed your entire life for me," I repeated, letting the words hang in the freezing air. "That is a fascinating narrative, Nancy. But since we are all standing here with the FBI, why do we not talk about your most memorable sacrifice? Let us talk about what happened when I was 18 years old." Nancy's breath hitched. Her eyes darted nervously toward Agent Keller, who was watching the exchange with intense, silent scrutiny. "Megan, do not do this," she hissed, dropping the maternal act for a split second before remembering her audience. "This is family business. We do not need to air our dirty laundry in front of strangers." "But they are not strangers," I replied smoothly. "They are federal investigators, and they are very interested in how you fund your lifestyle. Do you remember the week before I left for college? I had worked 3 jobs throughout high school to save up for my tuition. I had secured a sizable student loan to cover the rest. I was so proud. And then 2 days before I moved into the dorms, I went to the bank to check my balance. The account was empty, over $40,000 completely gone. I raised my voice slightly, ensuring every agent in the driveway could hear the reality of my upbringing. "Do you want to tell them where that money went, Nancy? Or should I?" My mother swallowed hard, her manicured hands trembling as she clutched the lapels of her expensive coat. "It was a misunderstanding," she stammered, her voice lacking its usual commanding tone. "Your father had a cash flow problem with a property. We needed to borrow it temporarily. We paid you back." "You never paid me back," I fired back, my voice cracking like a whip. "You forged my signature on the withdrawal slips. You drained my entire educational fund and my federal student loans. And you did not do it to save a property. You did it to buy Courtney a brand new Porsche convertible for her 21st birthday. You stole your youngest daughter's future to buy a luxury toy for your golden child." Courtney, still pinned against the hood of the police cruiser, let out a muffled, indignant scoff. "I deserved that car," she yelled over her shoulder, completely missing the point. "I was the face of the company. I needed to look successful." I ignored her completely, keeping my eyes locked on Nancy. "You forced me to drop out of my dream university. I had to enroll in community college, and work night shifts as a waitress just to survive, all while carrying the debt that you fraudulently took out in my name. You told me it was a lesson in financial independence. You told me I was being selfish for being upset. I took another step closer, my voice dropping to a low, lethal whisper. Do you think I became a forensic accountant because I liked math, Nancy? Do you think I spent years studying financial law, auditing procedures, and asset tracing just for fun? No. I chose this career because of you. I chose it because I vowed that I would learn exactly how people like you hide your dirty money. I spent my entire adult life turning myself into the exact weapon needed to dismantle your empire. I did not just stumble upon your Ponzi scheme. I have been hunting you since I was 18 years old. The silence that followed was absolute. The only sound was the low hum of the idling federal vehicles and the crackle of police radios. The agents surrounding us stared at Nancy with open disgust. The facade of the wealthy, respectable mountain matriarch was entirely shattered. She was no longer a victim of a hormonal grieving daughter. She was exposed as a common thief, a predator who had cannibalized her own child to feed her vanity. Nancy opened her mouth, searching frantically for a defense, a deflection, a way to spin the narrative back in her favor. But there was nothing left. The irrefutable truth hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Her shoulders sagged, and the fake tears dried up instantly, replaced by a hollow, terrified realization that her lifetime of manipulation had finally reached its absolute end. She slowly lowered her head, staring at the muddy ground, utterly silenced. With my mother completely neutralized, I turned my attention to the other side of the porch. It was time to deal with the weakest link in their crumbling chain. I looked past the agents, my eyes locking onto the man still kneeling in the dirt, sobbing hysterically with his hands cuffed behind his back. Trey was a mess. The crisp designer suit Courtney had undoubtedly picked out for him was smeared with mud, the fabric tearing at the knee where he had dropped to the ground. He was shivering violently, his broad shoulders shaking as the cold mountain air mixed with pure, unadulterated terror. For years, Trey had convinced himself that he was part of the inner circle. He had swallowed their subtle microaggressions, their condescending remarks, and their constant reminders that they had elevated him, all because he wanted to provide a luxurious life for his 5-year-old son, Jackson. I walked slowly across the gravel driveway, my boots crunching loudly, until I stood directly over him. Trey did not look up. He kept his chin tucked to his chest, tears mixing with the dirt on his face. "Look at me, Trey," I commanded, my voice flat and authoritative. He flinched, but slowly raised his head. His eyes were completely bloodshot, filled with a desperate, pleading vulnerability that my parents and sister lacked entirely. He was not a sociopath like them. He was just a coward who had gotten in way too deep. "You know exactly how this plays out, do you not?" I said, looking down at him. "You are a highly educated financial professional. You have seen the statistics. When a $50 million Ponzi scheme collapses, the federal government does not care about family loyalty. They care about paper trails, and whose signature is on every single piece of forged collateral, Trey, whose name is listed as the chief financial officer on the shell companies. It is mine." Trey choked out, his voice a pathetic rasp. "But you know I did not mastermind this, Megan. You know your father forced me to sign those documents. He told me he would cut us off, that he would take Courtney and Jackson away from me if I did not play along." I know that I replied evenly, but a jury will not care. What a jury will see is a wealthy, well-connected white family pointing their fingers at their black son-in-law, claiming he went rogue and embezzled the funds behind their backs. They have spent 5 years setting you up to be their perfect fall guy. They gave you the fancy title in the corner office so that when the FBI inevitably knocked on the door, you would be the one wearing the handcuffs while they claimed ignorance. They are going to serve you up on a silver platter, Trey. Trey let out a gut-wrenching sob, dropping his head back down. He knew I was right. The realization that he had sacrificed his integrity for people who viewed him as entirely disposable was breaking him apart in real time. "You are looking at a minimum of 20 years in a federal penitentiary for wire fraud, bank fraud, and conspiracy." I continued, letting the weight of the sentence crush the last of his denial. Jackson is 5 years old. If you go down for this, you will not see him graduate high school. You will not see him go to college. You will spend the next 2 decades in a concrete box while Courtney divorces you, takes whatever money she can hide, and teaches your son that his father is a convicted felon. Please. Trey begged, his chained hands shaking uncontrollably. Megan, please help me. I will do whatever you want. I cannot lose my son. I looked over at Agent Keller, who gave a brief, subtle nod. I turned my attention back to the trembling man at my feet. I am not doing this to help you, Trey. I am doing this to ensure the people who actually built this empire of lies never see the outside of a cell again, I told him coldly. I have already spoken with the Assistant United States Attorney. They are willing to offer you a federal immunity deal, full protection, no prison time. You keep your freedom and you get to go home to Jackson tonight, but it comes with a price. Anything. Trey gasped, looking up at me as if I were a lifeline thrown into a stormy ocean. You have to testify, I stated clearly. You have to hand over the physical burner phones, the unredacted offshore ledgers, and every single piece of correspondence proving Howard and Nancy orchestrated the fraud. You have to completely bury them in court. Trey hesitated, his eyes darting toward the police cruisers where his in-laws were being held. The years of psychological conditioning and fear of Howard's wrath briefly paralyzed him. I raised my wrist, checking my watch. You have exactly 60 seconds to decide, Trey. Take the deal right now and be a father to your son, or get in the back of that cruiser and take the fall as the mastermind for a family that hates you. 60 seconds. Before Trey could even open his mouth to answer, a violent crash echoed across the driveway. Howard had thrown his entire body weight against the reinforced window of the police cruiser, his face pressed against the glass, contorted into a mask of absolute homicidal rage. The door had been left cracked open by an agent, and Howard used the gap to unleash his fury. Keep your damn mouth shut, Trey! Howard screamed, the veins in his neck bulging as he fought against the federal agents trying to shove him back into the seat. Do not say a single word. If you turn on this family, I swear to God I will destroy you. I will make sure you never see your kid again. Shut your mouth. His violent outburst hung in the damp air. Those threats had kept Trey completely paralyzed for 5 years. The fear of losing his son, his lifestyle, and my father's wrath had bound him to their empire. Hearing Howard scream while handcuffed suddenly stripped his threats of power. He was just a desperate, pathetic old man facing the rest of his life in a concrete cell. Trey looked from the cruiser back to me, his chest heaving as he gasped for air. He wiped his tear-streaked face with his heavy cuffed hands and stood up perfectly straight. He turned his body toward Agent Keller and the other federal investigators standing on the driveway. I will testify, Trey yelled, his voice cracking, but carrying a newfound desperate resolve. I will tell you absolutely everything. I want the immunity deal. Howard let out a muffled roar of pure rage from behind the reinforced glass of the cruiser, but Trey did not even flinch this time. He was fighting for his life now. The physical evidence is inside the cabin. Trey continued rapidly, the words spilling out of him as if he were purging poison from his veins. You do not just have the digital files on the servers. Howard is old school. He does not trust the cloud with the real numbers. He keeps physical ledgers for the Cayman Island accounts and a stash of prepaid burner phones he uses to contact the offshore brokers. Where are they? Agent Keller demanded, pulling a small notepad from his tactical vest. In the master bedroom, Trey answered, his words tumbling over each other. Underneath the Persian rug at the foot of the king-sized bed, there is a loose floorboard. You have to press down on the left corner of the plank to release the magnetic latch. The ledgers are wrapped in waterproof plastic alongside 6 burner phones and the physical passcodes for the crypto wallets. He put them there 3 days ago when the commercial lenders started asking questions. Keller immediately signaled to a team of agents standing by the front porch. 4 of them unholstered their flashlights and rushed through the front door, heavy boots thudding against the hardwood floors as they headed for the master bedroom to secure the evidence. You pathetic, spineless traitor, a shrill voice shrieked. Courtney was still pinned against the hood of the adjacent police car, her face twisted into a mask of absolute hatred. She turned her head as far as the agents would allow and spat violently in Trey's direction. "I should have listened to my father," Courtney screamed, her voice echoing through the dense forest. "You are nothing. We made you. We took you out of your pathetic little middle-class life and gave you the world, and this is how you repay us. You are a rat. You are a disgusting, ungrateful coward, and I am going to make sure Jackson grows up knowing his father is a traitor who destroyed his family." Trey looked at his wife, the woman he had loved and compromised his entire soul to please. The veil was completely lifted. He saw her not as the glamorous, successful woman she pretended to be, but as a vicious, entitled predator who would gladly feed him to the wolves to save her own skin. "You destroyed this family," Courtney Trey replied, his voice eerily calm despite the chaos around them. "You and your parents. I am just making sure our son does not grow up to be exactly like you." The family had completely devoured itself. The loyalty they had so proudly preached was nothing but a fragile illusion built on stolen money and shared guilt. The moment the consequences arrived, they turned into a pack of starving animals, eager to tear each other apart for a scrap of survival. Nancy was wailing hysterically against the side of another cruiser, mourning her ruined reputation. Courtney was screaming vile obscenities at the man she called her husband, and Trey was confessing to federal crimes as fast as he could speak. A few minutes later, an agent emerged from the cabin holding a thick bundle of leather-bound books and cheap cell phones. He held them up high in the air, nodding his head to Agent Keller. They had the smoking gun, the physical proof of $50 million in stolen assets. I looked over at my father's cruiser, expecting to see him completely broken and begging for mercy. Instead, Howard leaned back against the hard plastic seat. He looked at the evidence in the agent's hands, and then he looked directly at me. Slowly, a dark, chilling laugh rumbled in his chest, vibrating through the cracked window. He was actually laughing. He still thought he had one final untouchable safety net. His laugh grew louder, cutting through the damp mountain air with a harsh, grating edge. He was a man who had built his entire identity on the unshakable belief that he could simply outsmart everyone in the room. Even with his hands cuffed tightly behind his back and a team of federal agents currently tearing his physical evidence from the floorboards of his master bedroom, his staggering arrogance simply refused to die. Howard leaned his head forward until his forehead almost touched the reinforced glass of the cruiser window. He shifted his shoulders awkwardly, trying to straighten his custom-tailored jacket, despite the heavy steel cuffs restricting his wrists. He desperately wanted to project authority, to remind me that he was still the patriarch, the untouchable mastermind of the family. Agent Keller, noticing the commotion, signaled for the state trooper to open the cruiser door just a few inches to allow Howard to speak without shouting through the thick glass. "You really think you have won, Megan?" Howard sneered, his voice dripping with pure concentrated venom. "You think handing over some cheap burner phones and a few physical ledgers is going to completely destroy me? You always were incredibly short-sighted. You have absolutely no idea how real wealth actually works." He shifted comfortably on the hard plastic seat, crossing his ankles, as if he were sitting in a corporate boardroom instead of the back of a police car. "Go ahead and let Trey sing to the federal prosecutors." Howard continued, shooting a look of utter disgust toward the trembling man who was currently being escorted to a separate unmarked vehicle. "Let your mother cry on the driveway, and let Courtney throw her little temper tantrums. You might be able to convince a jury of working-class nobodies to give me a few years in a minimum security federal camp. But you listen to me very carefully, Megan. You will never take my money. We will never be broke." Howard tilted his head toward the sprawling $4 million mountain cabin looming behind me. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated his face, casting deep, sinister shadows across his features. "Do you honestly think I would leave my primary assets exposed to a standard federal seizure?" he asked, his tone mocking and condescending. "I saw this coming the moment those commercial lenders started auditing our accounts last month. I took the appropriate measures to protect my legacy. This entire property, the massive estate down in the suburbs, The luxury vehicles and the offshore contingency funds, they are all locked away in an airtight, irrevocable trust. It is completely bulletproof. The federal government cannot pierce it. The state cannot touch it. And you certainly cannot lay a single finger on it. The smirk on his face widened into a grotesque display of absolute overconfidence. He was feeding off his own delusions of grandeur. I have friends in very high places, Megan, he boasted. I will serve a fraction of my sentence. And while I am sitting comfortably in a country club prison, I am going to hire the most ruthless appellate lawyers in the United States. I will drain that trust fund completely dry just to bury you in civil litigation. I will sue you for defamation for emotional distress and for corporate espionage. I will drag you and your fatherless child through the court system for decades until you are living on the street begging me for loose change. He genuinely believed every single word he was saying. He truly thought he had outplayed the Federal Bureau of Investigation and a senior forensic accountant. He thought his high-priced estate planners had built an impenetrable legal fortress around his stolen millions. For a brief second, the toxic dynamic of my family flared up again. I looked over at Nancy, who had stopped her hysterical wailing and was now looking at her husband with a renewed glimmer of desperate hope. Even Courtney had stopped struggling against the hood of the police car, turning her head to listen to her father's promises of legal revenge. They were all desperately clinging to this final mythical stronghold. They believed the money would save them just like it always had. I stood quietly on the muddy gravel driveway, letting my father exhaust his breath. I let him bask in his imaginary victory. I felt the cold mountain wind blow past me, but the freezing chill did not bother me anymore. I looked at the man who had abandoned me in the deep forest to protect his fortune. I looked at the man who thought he could use my dead husband's life insurance to plug the holes in his sinking ship. I did not scream. I did not argue with his delusional threats. I simply looked him dead in the eye and smiled. It was not a sad smile or a relieved smile or even a bitter one. It was a genuine, terrifying smile. A smile that made my father's arrogant smirk instantly vanish from his face. I did not rush my response. I let my father revel in his fantasy for a few moments longer, watching the smug satisfaction settle into the lines of his face. He truly believed he had beaten the system. He believed that his expensive lawyers and his complicated legal structures made him invincible. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out a key fob. I pressed the button, and the trunk of the unmarked federal SUV parked beside me popped open. Agent Keller stepped aside as I walked over to the trunk and retrieved my heavy leather briefcase. The metallic click of the latches echoed sharply over the low hum of the idling engines. I opened the case and pulled out a thick, heavy manila folder. Across the top, stamped in bold, unmissable red ink, were the letters IRS. I turned back to my father and walked slowly toward the cruiser until I was standing right in front of the cracked window. "You are right about one thing, Howard," I began, my voice perfectly steady, carrying none of the emotional hysteria he always accused me of having. An irrevocable trust is by definition incredibly difficult to break. It is designed to be an absolute legal fortress, protecting assets from creditors and civil lawsuits. Mitchell and your estate planners did a fantastic job setting it up. Howard chuckled a dry, grating sound. "I am glad you finally acknowledge my intelligence, Megan. Now tell these agents to pack up and get off my property." I ignored his command entirely. I opened the folder and pulled out the top document. It was printed on heavy official stock, bearing the raised seal of the United States Department of the Treasury. "But there is a very specific, catastrophic flaw in your legal strategy," Howard, I continued, my eyes scanning the text I already knew by heart. "It is a concept known as fraudulent conveyance." Howard stopped chuckling. The smug expression on his face began to waver, replaced by a flicker of confusion and the very beginnings of actual fear. "You see," I explained, leaning slightly closer to the window, "an irrevocable trust only protects legitimate assets. If the federal government can prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that the trust was funded using the direct proceeds of a criminal enterprise, that legal fortress completely disintegrates. I held the document up, pressing it flat against the reinforced glass so my father could read the bold, capitalized heading. Order of Asset Forfeiture and Trust Dissolution. 3 weeks ago, I said, my voice dropping to a low, lethal register. I provided the Federal Financial Crimes Division with the exact routing numbers showing how you funneled stolen investor capital from your Ponzi scheme directly into the corpus of your family trust. I gave them the dates, the amounts, and the forged authorization signatures. Howard stared at the document, his eyes darting frantically across the legal jargon. He lunged forward against his restraints, hitting his shoulder against the door panel. That is impossible, he spat spit, flying against the glass. The trust is completely blind. Mitchell scrubbed the origins of those funds. Mitchell is a real estate lawyer. Howard, I replied, my tone dripping with absolute contempt. I am a forensic accountant. I spend my life untangling the messes people like Mitchell make. I found every single dirty dollar, and once the IRS verified my findings, they moved with unprecedented speed. I pulled another document from the folder, holding it up next to the first one. Because the initial seed money for the trust was obtained through federal wire fraud, the judge ruled that the trust was invalid from its very inception. The federal government pierced your irrevocable trust 21 days ago, Howard. The safety net you just bragged about does not exist anymore. It has been entirely dissolved. The silence that followed was absolute. The wind seemed to stop blowing. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated the sheer, unadulterated terror consuming my father. Every single asset held within that trust has been seized by the United States government. I told him, delivering the final devastating blow. The offshore accounts are gone. The retirement funds are gone. The luxury vehicles are impounded. The multi-million-dollar estate in the suburbs is currently being boarded up by federal marshals. You are completely and utterly bankrupt. Howard's smirk vanished entirely. His jaw dropped and the color drained so completely from his face, he looked like a corpse propped up in the back of the police cruiser. The untouchable patriarch, the man who believed he was smarter than the FBI, the IRS, and his own daughter, was finally realizing that he had lost absolutely everything. His jaw hung open, but no words came out. The man who had spent his entire life controlling every room he walked into was completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of his defeat. He stared at the forfeiture order pressed against the glass of the police cruiser, his eyes scanning the official federal seal over and over again, as if hoping it would suddenly dissolve into a prank. It did not. The paper was real, and so was the complete annihilation of his financial empire. Nancy let out a low, guttural wail that sounded more like a wounded animal than a human being. She slumped against the side of the vehicle, her expensive coat dragging in the wet mud. All of it, she gasped, clutching her chest as if she were having a heart attack. The house, the cars, the club memberships. You let her take all of it, Howard. You said we were protected. Howard finally found a fraction of his voice. He swallowed hard, his throat clicking audibly in the quiet mountain air. He tore his eyes away from the document and looked at the sprawling luxury cabin looming behind me. The massive stone fireplace was still glowing through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The imported leather furniture still sat perfectly arranged. He clung to that visual like a drowning man clutching a piece of driftwood. No, Howard whispered, shaking his head frantically. No, that is not true. The primary residence is gone, yes. The offshore accounts might be frozen. But this property is different. This mountain cabin was not in the trust, Megan. I was not stupid enough to put all my eggs in one basket. I deeded this cabin to a completely separate holding company in Nevada. It is completely isolated from the Cascade Mountain Properties umbrella. You cannot touch this house. We still have this. We can sell it. We can start over. He was grasping at straws, desperately trying to salvage a single shred of his dignity and his wealth. He needed to believe that he had outsmarted me on at least one front. I slowly pulled the IRS document away from the glass and slid it back into my leather briefcase. I reached into the very back of the folder and pulled out one final piece of paper. It was not a federal forfeiture order. It was a standard county-issued property deed printed on thick parchment paper and bearing the official gold seal of the State Real Estate Commission. You are right, Howard, I said, my voice eerily calm against his rising panic. You did put this cabin under a separate Nevada holding company. It was a very clever move to avoid liability. But there is a massive problem with isolating an asset like that. When you sever it from the primary corporate accounts, you have to remember to actually pay the property taxes out of pocket. And since you were funneling every spare cent into keeping your Ponzi scheme afloat over the last 3 years, you neglected to pay the county tax assessments on this luxury retreat. Howard's eyes widened. He knew exactly what happens when property taxes go unpaid. The IRS did not have to seize this cabin, I explained, taking a slow step backward so I could address both my father in the cruiser and my mother crying on the ground. The county stepped in and did the dirty work for them. Once the federal government pierced your primary trust and froze your accounts, the local tax authority realized they were never going to get the hundreds of thousands of dollars you owed them in back taxes. So they quietly foreclosed on this property. Courtney, still handcuffed to the hood of the adjacent car, stopped struggling. Foreclosed, she repeated the word sounding completely foreign in her mouth. What do you mean foreclosed? This is our house. It was your house, I corrected her sharply. But last Wednesday morning, while you were busy trying to figure out how to steal my dead husband's life insurance money, the county held a closed federal auction at the courthouse downtown. They liquidated this property to immediately recoup the unpaid taxes. Howard pressed his face against the glass, his breath fogging the window. Who bought it? He demanded, his voice dropping to a terrified rasp. Who bought my house? An anonymous limited liability company registered in Delaware placed the winning bid, I told him, keeping my tone strictly professional. Because it was a distressed tax auction, they acquired this $4 million estate for absolute pennies on the dollar. It was the bargain of a lifetime. A completely clean title wiped free of all your previous liens and fraudulent holding companies. I held up the deed, letting the flashing red and blue lights catch the gold county seal. I unfolded the heavy parchment paper and held it flat so my father could read the name printed clearly on the ownership line. I am the sole proprietor of that Delaware LLC. I stated, my voice ringing out clearly through the freezing mountain fog. I used the very life insurance money you tried to steal from me to buy this estate. Howard stopped breathing. Nancy stopped crying. The absolute finality of their ruin hung over the driveway like a heavy iron weight. I looked my father directly in the eyes, delivering the ultimate inescapable truth. You are not standing on your property, Howard. You are standing on mine. I did not wait for my father to process the absolute destruction of his ego. I turned my back on the police cruiser, leaving him to stare blankly at the fog rolling across the property he no longer owned. The driveway was still swarming with federal agents and state troopers, the flashing red and blue lights reflecting off the wet pavement. I walked deliberately toward the group of troopers standing near the porch, my boots crunching rhythmically against the gravel. "Excuse me, officers," I said, my voice carrying a sharp professional authority that immediately commanded their attention. The lead trooper, a tall man with a stern face, turned toward me. "Yes, ma'am," he replied, nodding respectfully. "Agent Keller briefed us on your cooperation. Is there something else you need before we transport the suspects?" "Actually, there is," I said, reaching back into my leather briefcase. I pulled out a certified copy of the Delaware LLC registration and handed it to the trooper. As the sole proprietor of the holding company that now legally owns this estate, I need to officially report a crime. The trooper looked at the paperwork, then back up at me, his brow furrowing slightly. "A crime," he repeated. "Beyond the federal fraud indictments." Yes, I confirmed, my tone perfectly even. When I arrived here this afternoon, I found 4 individuals occupying my private residence without my permission. They bypassed the security gate, entered my home, consumed expensive alcohol, and damaged the interior property. I am formally requesting that Howard, Nancy, and Courtney be charged with criminal trespassing and breaking and entering. The trooper blinked, processing the audacity of the request before a slow, understanding nod formed. He looked down at the paperwork, verifying the seals and signatures. "You have the deed and the legal right to the property," he noted. "We can certainly add those charges to the arrest report. It will be up to the local district attorney to pursue them, but given the circumstances, I imagine they will be happy to stack the deck. I want it on the record, I insisted. They do not have a lease, they do not have permission, they are trespassers. Across the driveway, Courtney had been listening. The shock of the foreclosure revelation had momentarily stunned her into silence, but the reality of these new charges finally pierced through her thick armor of entitlement. She realized I was not just taking their money, I was systematically burying them under a mountain of legal consequences from which they would never escape. "You cannot do this," Courtney screamed, her voice tearing through the quiet mountain air. She struggled violently against the hood of the police car, her expensive boots scraping desperately against the wet pavement. "You cannot charge us with trespassing in our own home." "It is not your home, Courtney," I said, turning to face her. My voice was entirely devoid of sympathy. "You lost the right to call this place home when you decided to fund it with stolen money. You are just a squatter in a designer sweater." She let out a guttural shriek of pure, unadulterated rage, thrashing against the firm grip of the federal agents holding her down. "I am going to kill you," she wailed, tears of frustration streaming down her face. "I am going to tear you apart, Megan. You are nothing. You are a pathetic, jealous little nobody." The agents quickly subdued her, pressing her face firmly back against the cold metal of the cruiser hood. "That is enough," one of the agents barked. "You are only making this worse for yourself." But Courtney could not stop. The realization of total, absolute defeat had finally hit her. She had spent her entire life believing she was untouchable, protected by her parents' wealth and her own perceived superiority. Now she was handcuffed to a police car covered in mud, facing a lengthy federal prison sentence, and being charged with breaking and entering by the very sister she had always considered beneath her. She looked over at Nancy, who was still slumped against the side of the vehicle, sobbing quietly into her hands. "Mom, do something," Courtney pleaded, her voice cracking. "Tell them to stop. Tell them she is lying." But Nancy did not look up. The matriarch, who had always had a plan, a manipulation or a lie ready for any situation, was completely broken. She just shook her head, slowly defeated. Courtney then looked toward the cruiser holding our father. "Dad," she screamed, her voice desperate and shrill. "Fix this! You promised you would fix this!" Howard sat motionless in the back seat, staring blankly straight ahead. He did not look at his golden child. He did not offer any reassurances. He was completely paralyzed by the realization that his empire was gone and there was absolutely nothing he could do to get it back. The finality of the situation crushed whatever remaining defiance Courtney possessed. The absolute finality of my words hung in the freezing mountain air like a physical weight. Howard did not scream. He did not issue another hollow threat about high-priced appellate lawyers or civil lawsuits. The realization that I had used his own stolen money, the very life insurance policy he had tried to extort from me, to buy his prized sanctuary out from under him, completely shattered whatever remained of his ego. He simply slumped backward against the hard plastic seat of the police cruiser, his eyes glazing over as he stared out into the fog. Courtney, still pinned against the hood of the adjacent vehicle, stopped thrashing. The wild, feral energy that had driven her to attack me just minutes earlier evaporated entirely. For her entire 30 years of life, Courtney had operated under the delusion that she was untouchable. She was the golden child shielded by our parents' wealth, protected by their ruthless legal maneuvers, and insulated by a bubble of pure entitlement. She had always believed that no matter how cruelly she behaved, there would always be a safety net waiting to catch her. But as she looked at our father sitting broken in the back of the cruiser, and our mother weeping hysterically in the mud, that safety net dissolved into nothing. There was no money left to bail her out. There was no high-powered attorney coming to rescue her. There was no luxury cabin to retreat into. Her knees buckled. The two federal agents holding her arms were caught off guard by the sudden dead weight. They loosened their grip instinctively, and Courtney slid off the cold metal hood of the cruiser. She crumpled directly onto the wet, muddy gravel of the driveway. The designer cashmere sweater she had bragged about, the expensive leather boots, and her perfectly styled hair were instantly soaked in the freezing grime. She did not try to stand back up. Instead, the golden child broke down in a display of pure, unadulterated terror. She began sobbing uncontrollably, her chest heaving with ugly, hyperventilating gasps. It was not the theatrical, manipulative crying our mother used to gain sympathy. It was the primal panic of a spoiled predator, finally caught in a trap she could not buy her way out of. "Megan, please," Courtney wailed, dragging herself forward on her knees through the mud until she was just a few feet away from my boots. "Please do not do this. Do not let them take me to jail. I cannot go to prison. I will not survive in there." She reached her handcuffed wrists out toward me, her face completely ruined by tears and smeared makeup. "Just tell them to let me stay here," she begged, her voice cracking into a pathetic squeak. "This is your house now. You own it. Tell them it was a mistake. Tell them I can stay in the guest room. I will do anything. I will clean the house. I will disappear. Just please do not let them lock me in a cage." I looked down at the woman weeping at my feet. I thought about the 18-year-old girl whose college fund was stolen so this exact sister could drive a Porsche. I thought about the pregnant widow abandoned on a deserted logging road to freeze just hours ago, her purse tossed into a ditch while this sister laughed. I felt absolutely no pity. I reached my hand into the front pocket of my tailored maternity blazer. Courtney looked up at me, her red, swollen eyes widening with a sudden, desperate flicker of hope. In her twisted, desperate mind, she actually thought I was reaching for a phone to call off the federal agents. She thought I was going to pull out a handkerchief to wipe her tears, or a set of keys to unlock her cuffs. She genuinely believed that at the very last second, family loyalty would force me to save her. I pulled my hand out of my pocket. I was holding a single folded piece of paper. I looked her dead in the eyes, my expression a mask of absolute ice. I did not offer her a hand up. I did not offer her forgiveness. I simply let go of the paper. It fluttered down through the cold, damp air, landing gently in the muddy puddle right next to her trembling knees. Courtney stared down at the piece of paper, her sobs hitching in her throat. "What is this?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the idling engines of the police cruisers. "That is the invoice for the deep cleaning service," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the quiet driveway. $500. You tracked mud all over my front porch. The sheer calculated pettiness of the gesture was the ultimate dismissal. In the face of a $50 million federal fraud indictment, I was treating her like a negligent, dirty tenant. I was not acknowledging her as a formidable rival or a sister. I was acknowledging her as a nuisance who had scuffed my property. The absolute humiliation of that realization hit Courtney harder than any physical blow ever could. She let out a hollow, defeated gasp, her head dropping forward until her chin touched her chest. She had nothing left to say. Agent Keller stepped forward from the shadows of the command vehicle, signaling to the perimeter team. "We are done here," he commanded, his voice sharp and authoritative. "Load them up for transport to the federal holding facility." The agents moved immediately. They grabbed Courtney by her armpits, hauling her up from the mud. She did not fight them this time. She just hung limply between them, her spirit entirely broken as they dragged her toward a waiting SUV. Nancy was lifted from the ground, still weeping silently, and shoved into the back of a separate vehicle. Trey was already secured in another car, his head bowed in defeat. One by one, the agents slammed the heavy, reinforced doors of the federal cruisers shut. The sharp, metallic thuds echoed through the mountain valley like gunshots, sealing my family inside their new reality. 6 months had passed since those heavy doors slammed shut on the mountain, sealing my family inside their new reality. The crisp autumn air of that afternoon had long since given way to a bright, promising spring. I sat in the front row of the federal courtroom in downtown Seattle, the polished mahogany benches feeling entirely different from the damp, freezing gravel of my former driveway. But the most profound difference was not the weather or the location. It was the weight resting warmly against my chest. I looked down at my 2-month-old daughter Grace sleeping peacefully in her carrier. She was the spitting image of Ryan, with a tuft of dark hair and a calm demeanor that anchored my soul. The crippling grief that had consumed me during my pregnancy had been replaced by a fierce, undeniable strength. I was no longer the vulnerable, grieving widow my family had tried to exploit. I was a mother, a survivor, and the primary witness for the federal prosecution. The heavy oak doors on the side of the courtroom swung open, cutting through the low murmur of the gallery. Two armed United States Marshals stepped through the frame, followed immediately by the familiar yet entirely unrecognizable figures of my family. The contrast between my new life and their absolute ruin was staggering. Howard walked in first. The imposing, untouchable patriarch, who used to terrorize boardrooms in custom Italian suits, was gone. He shuffled forward in a bright orange Department of Corrections jumpsuit, his wrists bound by heavy steel chains that clinked softly with every step. The stress of the last 6 months in a federal holding facility had aged him a full decade. His hair, once thick and styled, was now thin, entirely gray and unkempt. The arrogant puff of his chest had completely deflated, leaving a hollow, broken old man who stared at the floor tiles as he moved toward the defense table. Nancy followed closely behind him, and the sight of her was almost jarring. My mother had built her entire identity around her appearance, leveraging her country club elegance to manipulate everyone around her. That elegance had been stripped away completely. Her face was pale and drawn, the lack of expensive skincare and makeup exposing the deep, harsh lines of her cruelty. The dark roots of her hair had grown out inches past the faded blonde dye, and she looked frail. Her shoulders hunched forward as if the weight of her public humiliation was physically crushing her spine. But it was Courtney who looked the most devastated. The golden child, the sister who had always believed she was inherently better than everyone else, looked completely hollowed out. Her once vibrant eyes were dull and sunken, framed by dark circles of chronic exhaustion and terror. The smug, entitled smirk she wore while throwing my purse into the mud was a distant memory. As she shuffled toward her seat, the chains around her ankles scraping against the floor, she looked small, pathetic, and entirely defeated. As they settled into their chairs at the defense table, Howard slowly lifted his head. His tired eyes scanned the gallery behind the prosecution, eventually locking onto me. I did not look away. I sat perfectly straight, my posture radiating the quiet, unshakable confidence he had always tried to beat out of me. I let him look at the daughter he had tried to break, now thriving and victorious. I let him look at the granddaughter he had been willing to leave fatherless and penniless in the woods, now sleeping safely in my arms. Nancy turned her head and saw me too. Her eyes welled up with tears, but they were not tears of remorse. They were tears of pure, selfish regret. She realized in that moment that the family she had prized over me, the wealth she had chosen over her own flesh and blood, had left her with absolutely nothing. She had traded her daughter and her future for a temporary illusion of power, and now the bill had finally come due. Courtney refused to look in my direction at all. She kept her eyes glued to the wooden table, her hands trembling in her lap. The reality of the federal justice system had finally broken her spirit. There was no one left to blame, no one left to manipulate, and no one left to save her. A sudden hush fell over the courtroom as the heavy wooden door behind the bench opened. "All rise," the bailiff called out, his voice echoing through the silent room. The rustle of clothing filled the air as everyone in the gallery stood up. I gently supported Grace's head as I rose to my feet. The federal judge, a stern-looking man with decades of experience dismantling white-collar criminal empires, took his seat at the elevated bench. He arranged the thick stack of sentencing reports in front of him, his expression grim and resolute. The judge picked up his wooden gavel and struck the sounding block with a sharp, echoing crack that signaled the end of the line. The sharp crack of the heavy wooden gavel echoed through the courtroom, instantly silencing the low murmur of the gallery. The judge adjusted his glasses and looked down at the defense table. He did not look at the four defendants with anger, but rather with a profound disgust reserved for those who casually destroyed innocent lives for their own comfort. "This court has spent the last 2 weeks reviewing a staggering mountain of evidence," the judge began, his voice filling the room with absolute authority. "In my 30 years on the bench, the sheer scale of the fraud orchestrated by Apex Pinnacle Holdings and the utter disregard for basic human decency exhibited by the leadership of this family is truly unprecedented. He turned to the far left of the table. Trey sat rigidly in a cheap gray suit, his hands clasped tightly. Trey, the judge said, his tone softening slightly. You were a willing participant. You signed forged documents and enjoyed the illicit wealth. However, the court recognizes that your comprehensive cooperation and testimony were absolutely instrumental in securing these convictions. Trey closed his eyes tightly, his chest trembling as he braced himself. I am sentencing you to 5 years of supervised probation, the judge ruled. You will serve no prison time. However effective immediately, you are permanently barred from holding any position within the financial sector for life. Trey let out a loud, shuddering exhale, weeping tears of absolute relief. He lost his career and reputation, but he kept his freedom. He would get to go home to his son tonight. The judge shifted his gaze. Howard stood up, his chains rattling loudly against the wooden furniture. He tried to maintain his once proud posture, but his knees were visibly shaking. Howard, the judge said, his voice hardening into steel. You were the architect of this $50 million Ponzi scheme. You preyed on innocent people and used their money to fund a grotesque display of personal excess. You showed zero remorse throughout the trial, repeatedly attempting to obstruct justice. Your arrogance is only matched by your greed. I am sentencing you to 15 years in a federal penitentiary. Howard swayed on his feet. The number hit him like a physical blow to the stomach. 15 years. Given his advanced age, it was effectively a life sentence. He collapsed back into his chair, his eyes completely vacant. Nancy was forced to stand next. She leaned heavily on the wooden table, weeping bitterly. Nancy, the judge continued, you were not a passive observer. You actively participated in laundering these funds and happily built your social empire on stolen money. You manipulated everyone to protect your lifestyle. I sentence you to 10 years in federal prison. Nancy let out a loud wail, her legs giving out completely as her defense attorney caught her. 10 years in a concrete cell without her credit cards or her false sense of superiority. Finally, the judge looked at Courtney. The golden child stood up, her jaw clenched tightly, radiating a toxic defensive anger. Courtney, the judge said, shaking his head in disbelief. Your behavior has been nothing short of appalling. You committed blatant perjury on the stand. You displayed zero remorse for the victims. And your violent outbursts demonstrate a complete lack of accountability. Because you consider yourself above the law, I am applying it with maximum severity. Courtney's eyes widened in sheer terror. I am sentencing you to 7 years. And due to your documented history of violent behavior and lack of cooperation, you will serve that time in a maximum security federal facility. Courtney shrieked. It was a horrifying, piercing sound. No! She screamed, thrashing wildly against her attorney. You cannot do this to me. I do not belong in there with those people. The judge ignored her hysterics and raised his gavel. This court is adjourned, he announced, bringing the mallet down with a final echoing crack. Federal bailiffs moved in immediately to secure the prisoners. They grabbed Courtney's arms, dragging her toward the side exit as she kicked and screamed obscenities. Howard stood up slowly, looking like a ghost as he was led away without looking back. As a large bailiff approached Nancy, she suddenly dug her heels into the floor. She looked frantically over her shoulder, her mascara-stained eyes scanning the gallery until they locked onto me. I was standing up gently, adjusting my newborn daughter's soft pink blanket, ready to walk out of those heavy doors and leave this toxic chapter behind forever. Wait, Nancy pleaded, her voice cracking with pure, undeniable desperation as she reached her shackled hands out toward the wooden partition dividing us. She turned her tear-streaked face to the armed bailiff. Please, officer, just give me 1 minute. Let me speak to my daughter. Just one last moment. I am begging you. The bailiff hesitated, his hand resting firmly on my mother's shoulder. He glanced toward the prosecution table, then looked back at me. The courtroom had mostly emptied out, the heavy oak doors closing behind the departing spectators. I stood perfectly still in the aisle, my newborn daughter resting warmly against my chest. A part of me wanted to simply turn my back, walk out into the Seattle sunshine, and never look at this woman again. But another part of me, The part that had spent 33 years seeking closure from a mother who was incapable of giving it knew I needed to hear whatever she had to say. I needed to witness the absolute end of her manipulation. I gave the bailiff a small, almost imperceptible nod. He stepped back just half a pace, allowing Nancy to grip the top edge of the wooden partition that separated the gallery from the defense area. Her knuckles were white, the heavy steel cuffs clinking loudly against the polished mahogany. I walked slowly down the aisle, my boots making soft thuds against the carpet. I stopped a few feet away from the wooden barrier, keeping a safe distance. Up close, the devastation on her face was even more pronounced. The confident, sneering matriarch who had weaponized my grief in the back of a luxury SUV 6 months ago was entirely gone. Her skin was sallow, her eyes bloodshot and swollen from weeks of crying in a concrete cell. The harsh fluorescent lights of the courtroom exposed every wrinkle and line she had desperately tried to hide with expensive treatments. She looked at me, and then her eyes dropped to the pink blanket bundled in my arms. Megan. Nancy gasped, her breath catching in her throat. Her voice was a frantic, ragged whisper. "You look so beautiful." "The baby, she is perfect. She looks just like Ryan." I did not thank her. I did not offer to step closer so she could see her granddaughter. I just stared at her, my face a mask of absolute indifference. Her attempt to use my daughter to soften me up was predictable and pathetic. It was the same tactic she had used my entire life, offering a crumb of affection right before making an unreasonable demand. "What do you want, Nancy?" I asked, my voice completely flat, devoid of any warmth or familial affection. "You have 1 minute before he takes you away." She swallowed hard, realizing the maternal flattery was completely useless. The desperation in her eyes hardened into raw, unfiltered panic. "It is about Courtney." Nancy choked out, leaning as far over the partition as the chains would allow. "You heard the judge. 7 years in a maximum security facility. Megan, you know how she is. She is fragile. She is accustomed to a certain standard of living. She is not built for a place like that. She will not survive surrounded by hardened criminals. She will be eaten alive in there." I remained perfectly still, adjusting the weight of the baby carrier. "Courtney is a grown woman who made her own choices," I replied coldly. "She can learn to adapt to her new environment." "No, you do not understand," Nancy pleaded, her voice rising in pitch as the bailiff checked his watch. "She has nothing. The government took everything we owned. We cannot put any money on her books. She needs funds for the commissary, Megan. She needs money for extra food, for basic hygiene products, for phone calls. You have the estate now. You have your husband's insurance payout safely in the bank. You are a millionaire." The sheer audacity of her request hung heavily in the quiet courtroom. After orchestrating a $50 million fraud, after trying to steal my dead husband's life insurance, after abandoning me pregnant in the freezing wilderness, her final plea was not for forgiveness. It was not an apology for the decades of emotional abuse. It was a demand for a cash handout. "Please, Megan." Nancy sobbed, genuine tears streaming down her face and dripping onto the collar of her orange jumpsuit. "Just put a few $100s a month into her commissary account. That is all I am asking. It is pocket change for you. She is your sister. We are your family. No matter what happened between us, we are still blood. You cannot just leave your own flesh and blood to rot with absolutely nothing. You have to help her." She reached a trembling hand out across the wooden divider, desperate to make physical contact, desperate to bridge the massive chasm she had spent my entire life digging. I did not flinch. I did not take a step back, nor did I reach out to meet her hand. I just looked at the woman standing in front of me. I looked at the hands that had forged my signature to steal my college tuition. I looked at the face of the woman who had mocked my grief and told me I was selfish for wanting to protect my unborn child. I thought about the biting cold of the Cascade Mountains, the sound of their tires spinning in the gravel, and the terrifying silence of being completely discarded by the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling the steady heartbeat of my daughter against my chest. The toxic cycle was finally broken, and I was about to deliver my final response. I looked at my mother's outstretched hand, trembling with the weight of her demands. For 33 years, that hand had only ever taken from me. It had taken my college tuition, it had taken my self-esteem, it had taken my peace of mind, and ultimately, it had tried to take the very future my late husband left for our child. I shifted my weight, feeling the soft, steady rise and fall of Grace's breathing against my chest. Her fragile warmth was a stark, beautiful reminder of what genuine, unconditional love actually felt like. It was a love that asked for nothing in return. It was a love that my mother was entirely incapable of understanding. Nancy continued to whimper, reaching her chained wrists further over the polished mahogany divider. She kept repeating the word family over and over again, using it like a blunt weapon. She expected that word to pierce my armor, just as it always had when I was a vulnerable child, desperately seeking her approval. She thought guilt was a universal currency that she could still spend. I let her finish her desperate monologue. I let the silence stretch out in the massive courtroom, forcing her to sit in the incredibly uncomfortable reality that she no longer controlled the narrative. The federal bailiff shifted his weight, clearly ready to escort her back to the holding cells, but he gave me the space to finish what needed to be done. "You want to talk about family, Nancy?" I finally said, my voice echoing clearly in the vast, quiet space. It was not a question. It was a statement of absolute finality. "You think sharing genetics gives you a permanent pass to destroy my life without consequence? You think that because you gave birth to me, I owe you my silence, my money, and my obedience. But you are fundamentally wrong about what that word actually means." I took a deliberate step backward, increasing the physical and emotional distance between us. "Family isn't blood," I stated, the words landing like heavy stones in the quiet room. "Family doesn't leave a pregnant widow in the woods to freeze to protect their stolen money. Family does not forge signatures, manipulate grief, or cannibalize their own children to buy designer clothes and luxury mountain cabins. A real family protects each other. A real family sacrifices their own comfort to ensure the safety of the people they really love." Nancy lowered her trembling hands, gripping the edge of the partition, as her tears continued to fall. She was finally hearing the truth she had spent her entire life running away from. "What you built was not a family, Nancy." I continued, my tone completely devoid of any remaining anger or sorrow. "It was just a cartel disguised as a country club membership. You only valued the people around you based on how much they could contribute to your illusion of superiority. And you are only crying right now because I finally dismantled that exact illusion. You do not miss me. You do not care about Courtney surviving in a maximum security prison. You only care that you can no longer control the final outcome." I looked her directly in the eyes, delivering the final blow that would permanently sever the toxic cord between us. "You died to me on that mountain," I told her, the absolute truth ringing with a devastating clarity. "When you drove away and left me standing in the freezing fog, you severed the very last thread tying us together. I mourned the mother I never had on that dirt road. I am not your daughter anymore, Nancy. I am just the woman who finally held you accountable for your crimes." Nancy's mouth opened in a silent scream of absolute defeat. The realization that she could never manipulate me again finally shattered her completely. The bailiff, sensing the conversation had reached its conclusion, firmly grasped her elbow and pulled her away from the partition. She began to wail, a loud, echoing sound of pure devastation, as she was dragged toward the side exit. I turned my back completely on her cries. I did not flinch. I did not look over my shoulder as the heavy steel door of the holding area slammed shut, cutting off her wails entirely. I adjusted the blanket around my sleeping daughter and walked slowly down the center aisle of the federal courtroom. The heavy oak doors at the back of the room swung open, revealing the bustling courthouse hallway. I stepped through them, my boots carrying me purposefully toward the main exit. I pushed through the heavy revolving glass doors and stepped out into the bright Seattle sunlight. The crisp spring air filled my lungs, entirely free of the suffocating toxic chains forever. The drive back up the Cascade Mountains felt completely different this time. I was no longer a captive passenger in a luxury vehicle, waiting for the next emotional blow to land. I was driving my own car with the windows rolled down, letting the crisp mountain air rush in. In the back seat, Grace was babbling happily, completely oblivious to the dark history this winding road once held for us. When I pulled into the sprawling circular driveway of the $4 million estate, the heavy iron gates stood wide open, welcoming us home. The dark, oppressive energy that used to choke this property had entirely evaporated. The pristine lawn where federal cruisers had parked 6 months ago was now covered in colorful picnic blankets and wooden toys. I unbuckled Grace from her car seat and set her down on the thick green grass, watching her crawl safely toward a brightly painted sandbox. The massive stone cabin looming behind us was no longer a monument to my parents' greed and arrogance. It was a sanctuary. Using the life insurance money Ryan left behind, I had officially transformed the property into the Cascade Healing Retreat. It is now a fully funded safe haven and resource center specifically designed for victims of familial financial abuse. The luxurious guest rooms where my sister Courtney used to demand room service and throw tantrums are now occupied by women and men who are learning how to rebuild their credit, escape fraudulent debt, and reclaim their independence from toxic relatives. The grand dining room where my father used to hold court and belittle his son-in-law now hosts weekly financial literacy workshops and group therapy sessions. We took a fortress built on lies and manipulation and turned it into a foundation for absolute truth. Watching these survivors walk through the front doors, their shoulders heavy with the same guilt and confusion I used to carry, and seeing them leave with their heads held high, is the greatest justice I could have ever asked for. My family tried to bury me in this remote forest, but they did not realize I was a seed. I walked up the wooden steps of the front porch, the exact spot where I had handed my sister a $500 cleaning bill, and I looked directly into the camera lens. I know many of you watching this right now understand exactly what that suffocating weight feels like. If you are the designated scapegoat of your family, you have spent your entire life being told that you are the problem. You have been gaslit into believing that your personal boundaries are selfish, and that your demand for basic human respect is an act of rebellion. Society constantly conditions us to believe that blood is thicker than water, and that cutting off family members is the ultimate unforgivable sin. But the harsh reality is that toxic people will gladly use that societal pressure to keep you trapped in their endless cycle of abuse. They will demand your unconditional loyalty while offering you absolutely nothing but conditional love based on what they can extract from you. Do not ever let them convince you that protecting your sanity, your finances, and your children is a betrayal. The hardest thing you will ever do is look at the people who are supposed to protect you and realize they are actually your greatest predators. It shatters the fundamental understanding of what a family should be. But once you accept that terrifying truth, you take your power back completely. You stop waiting for an apology that is never going to come. You stop trying to prove your worth to people who are committed to misunderstanding you. And you start building a beautiful life that they cannot touch. You do not owe your abusers a seat at your table just because you share the same genetics. You owe it to yourself to break the generational curse once and for all. You owe it to your children to show them what a healthy, loving environment actually looks like, so they never have to heal from their own childhood. Rebuilding your life from scratch and walking away from everything you have ever known is terrifying. But I promise you, the profound peace you will find on the other side is worth every single tear you shed along the way. I look out over the sprawling lawn, watching my beautiful daughter laugh as she plays in the sunshine, and I know with absolute certainty that I made the right choice. She will never know their cruelty. If you have ever had to cut off toxic family to save yourself, tell your story in the comments. Like, subscribe, and remember your peace is worth protecting.